The first thing people noticed about Marcus Webb was the way he stood still. Not the way tall men sometimes stand still, a little bent at the shoulder, a little apologetic, trying to redistribute a frame that makes other people uncomfortable. This was different. When Marcus stood still, he was actually still. His hands didn't move, his weight didn't shift. His eyes did the work his body refused to do, methodical, patient, recording. And that combination, the absolute stillness and the quiet watching, made people in expensive suits feel observed in ways they hadn't prepared for. He was standing near the service elevator on the east side of the lobby when Preston Vance found him. Preston would explain it later. He'd say he received a report that someone from the catering staff had flagged an unfamiliar face near the service corridor. That he was simply executing security protocol on an evening that included a sitting senator. All of that was true. What Preston would not say, what he was not built to say, was that he had already decided what Marcus was before he covered the 20 feet between them. He'd made the decision in the time it took to cross the lobby. He made it based on the dark jeans and the plain white shirt and the old watch and the garment bag over the man's shoulder and the sheer physical fact of the man. And the way that fact in Preston's architecture of the world could only belong to one category in this particular corridor on this particular evening. Hey. Preston's voice carried the confidence of a man who had never been wrong about a lobby. This is a restricted area. Service staff uses the freight entrance on Mulberry. Marcus looked at him. Just looked. The lobby's ambient sound seemed to contract slightly in the space between them. "I'm a guest," Marcus said. Preston smiled. It was the smile of a man managing a situation. "I'm going to need you to come with me." He put his hand on Marcus's arm. From the registration table, 30 feet away, the small woman looked up. "Excuse me," she said. Nobody heard her the first time. The lobby of Meridian Tower was all marble and 20-foot ceilings and the low tide of 200 guests arriving for the Veterans Legacy Foundation Gala. Crystal glasses, heels on stone. The warming-up sound of a string quartet somewhere beyond the main doors. She said it again. "Excuse me." Her name was Claire Hartwell. She was 4 feet 11 inches tall, and she was standing at the registration table in an ivory blouse and dark slacks with a leather portfolio open beside her and a printed binder in her hands. And she was looking at Preston Vance with the expression of someone who has spent her entire life being looked through and has simply decided to be done with it. Preston turned to her. He smiled at her too. That was his second mistake of the evening. Nobody in that lobby was calculating Claire Hartwell. Nobody in the arriving crowd was tracking the small woman at the end of the registration table. In rooms like this one, marble floors, silver card holders, guests in black tie. People like Claire had spent years learning to move through entire evenings unseen. She had learned to use that invisibility the way other people used loudness. Tonight, she would use it once more. But first, a few hours back. Because the lobby was only the end of a story that had started much earlier. In 2 different parts of the city, with 2 people who had never met but who had spent their whole lives being made into something smaller than they were. Marcus Webb woke at 5:14 a.m. without an alarm. He'd done this for 22 years in the United States Army, and he'd done it in the 11 years since, and his body had simply decided that sleep was a thing that ended at 5:14, and that was that. He made coffee in the apartment he kept in the West End, the one with a view of the river and almost no furniture, because he kept intending to buy more and the intention never became action. He drank the coffee standing at the window. Below, the city was still mostly dark. The river caught what little light there was and held it loosely, the way rivers hold most things. He had agreed to be the keynote speaker for the Veterans Legacy Foundation Gala that evening because Dina Park had called him 6 times in 3 weeks, and because Dina Park was one of the most persistent people he had ever met, and because he had spent 2 hours at the Foundation's transitional housing program in October, and talked to a man named Garrett who was sleeping with his daughter on alternate weekends in a 2-room apartment the Foundation had helped him find, and the look on Garrett's face when he described putting up a shelf in his daughter's room, just a shelf, a simple white shelf, had done something to Marcus's chest that he was still processing 2 months later. He didn't love giving speeches, he didn't love the apparatus of galas. He'd given the eulogy at Arlington for 3 men he'd carried out of a valley in Afghanistan, and there was no version of a podium that would ever feel significant by comparison. But the work mattered. The housing program, the employment placement, the outreach coordinators working highway off-ramps in November. The work mattered, and it needed the room's money, and the room needed someone to stand in front of it, and so he'd said yes. He put on jeans and a white shirt because he was going to change in the hospitality suite. He'd done this at the 3 previous foundation galas. Arrived in something comfortable, changed before the program started, avoided the cocktail hour where people held his hand too long and told him his service meant something with their eyes already drifting to the next important face. His dress uniform was in the garment bag over his shoulder. His Medal of Honor, the one the foundation had asked him to wear, the one that weighed almost nothing and felt like carrying a piece of a specific valley on a specific day, was in its velvet box in his jacket pocket. He took the metro. He always took the metro. He'd owned a car for 2 years after leaving the army and then stopped because the city worked fine without it, and he liked the particular anonymity of public transit. The way nobody on a subway car had any claim on who you were or needed you to be anything except someone going somewhere. The woman across from him read a paperback novel without looking up for 6 consecutive stops, and Marcus decided he liked her for exactly that reason. At Meridian Tower, the main entrance was already busy with arriving guests in black tie. Marcus knew the building. He'd attended an unrelated event here 3 years prior and had the floor plan filed somewhere in his head, the way he kept most floor plans, retained without intention. The hospitality suite was off the east corridor. He'd approached from the east side of the building. He went through the lobby. What he noticed, entering, the registration table had been moved slightly from its standard position, 4 feet to the left of where building convention would have placed it. The shift put it out of the angle of the late evening light from the west-facing glass panels. Someone had thought about this. He registered it the way he registered most things, without analysis, just filed and noted and placed. He was looking for the east corridor when Preston's voice hit him. There was the scar on the left thumb, a thin white line along the outer edge, from 2009, from a place with a name that most of the people in this lobby would have needed a moment to locate on a map. Marcus had stopped noticing the scar years ago, but under the lobby chandelier, when he turned toward Preston's voice, it caught the light briefly. A small silver line on a still hand. The hand was still. That was the thing that training had made permanent. 22 years of the Army's particular education in what your body was and wasn't permitted to do when everything in the room was wrong. He could not make his hands move when they didn't need to move. He had stopped being able to do that somewhere around year 4, in a room much less comfortable than this one. Preston put a hand on his arm. Marcus looked at Preston's hand and then at Preston's face and felt something that was not quite anger and not quite anything else he had a clean word for. Something older and more tired than anger, something that had been standing in a line so long it had forgotten what it was originally waiting for. "I'm a guest," he said, and from 30 feet away the small woman at the registration table said, "Excuse me." Claire Hartwell had arrived at Meridian Tower at 3:27 p.m. She'd told Dina she'd be there at 4. She was always early to everything she said she'd attend, and she was always earlier than she said she'd be to the things that mattered. And this evening, 9 months of planning, 47 veterans served by the program, the Foundation's largest single fundraiser, mattered considerably. She had a large coffee and the leather portfolio and the calm of someone who had done this enough times to know which parts of the pre-event hours were productive and which were just anxiety wearing the clothes of preparation. She stood in the center of the lobby at 3:30 and looked at how the light came through the west-facing panels. And she looked at the registration table where the setup crew was still assembling the bracket system, and she saw immediately what the problem was. 4 feet to the left, she said. The crew lead looked at her. He was a foot taller than she was, and he had a clipboard and the building layout on it, and he looked at his layout and then back at the small woman in the ivory blouse with the large coffee. The standard position puts arriving guests looking west at 7 p.m. in July, she said. The sun will be in their faces for the first 40 minutes of arrival. She looked at the floor. 4 feet left. The bracket holes are already there. This table was in the renovated position during the 2019 installation. A pause. The crew lead looked at his layout again. "You were here in 2019?" he asked. "I oversaw the renovation," she said. "I'm on the Meridian Capital Board." She said this not to impress him but because it was the fastest way to resolve the next 45 seconds of the conversation. She'd learned that a long time ago, not to withhold credentials defensively, but to use them efficiently when they were the shortest path to the thing that needed doing. They moved the table 4 feet to the left. She helped. The crew watched her while she helped, this small woman with the portfolio under her arm crouching at the floor bracket with the pragmatic confidence of someone who had installed the thing originally and knew where all the screws were. After about 30 seconds of this, they stopped watching and just helped, which was the outcome she'd been aiming for. By 5 o'clock she had walked the event floor twice, adjusted the lighting in the southwest corner of the ballroom, confirmed the AV configuration with the technical team, and sat for 12 minutes in a chair against the back wall of the main room doing nothing at all. The 12 minutes of deliberate stillness was not an accident. She'd started building it into her event days about 4 years ago, after a board member who was also a cardiologist had looked at her blood pressure readout and said something she'd needed several days to fully receive. She sat in the chair and let the room settle and let her heartbeat find its own tempo. Then she opened the leather portfolio and drew a single horizontal line on a blank page, just the one line. Blue ink, thin. She'd done this since her second year at Georgetown Law, when a professor had told her that the first step to making any argument was deciding where you stood. She'd understood it literally and drawn a line on a page and found that the act of it, the deliberateness, the clean finality of the gesture genuinely settled something in her chest. She'd done it ever since, before depositions, before board votes, before conversations she needed to be fully present for, before evenings where she suspected something unexpected was going to happen. She hadn't consciously thought that when she drew the line at 3:35, but she'd learned to trust the instinct. The line was still on the page undisturbed when she opened the portfolio again at 6:47 p.m., and stood at the registration table and heard a voice from the East Wing say "hey" in a tone she knew from the first syllable. She'd been hearing that tone for 39 years. In conference rooms and airport terminals and hospital waiting rooms and the hallways of Georgetown Law. She'd heard it in restaurants where the host looked past her to see if there was a real customer behind her. She'd heard it in investment meetings where the questions were directed at the man beside her. She'd heard it in the voice of a venture capital partner in 2014 who'd looked at the foundation's business plan and asked who the lead was. She was the lead. She had always been the lead. The thing about being underestimated your entire life was that it sorted people into categories very efficiently. The people who looked past you were people who would eventually be surprised. The people who actually looked, who accounted for what they saw without editing it. Those were the people worth knowing. She looked at Marcus Webb across 30 feet of marble lobby, the garment bag over his shoulder, the old watch, the completely still hands. Preston Vance's fingers on his arm. She closed the binder. She walked around the table. Preston Vance had been managing events at Meridian Tower since the building was 10 years old and he was 32. And in the 22 years since he had developed a working theory of how lobbies functioned. The theory was not written down anywhere. It lived in his muscle memory, in the way he processed arriving guests, in the 3-second assessment that opened every encounter, in the filing system his instincts had constructed over 2 decades of managing access to a building that hosted senators and executives and the occasional foreign dignitary. He was genuinely good at the theory. It had served him well. His events ran on time and without incident, and the assessment system he'd built was so refined that he rarely had to consciously apply it anymore. It was just there, automatic, as natural as breathing, as invisible to him as the air he used. He was 54 years old. He had 2 daughters in their 20s who called on Sundays. He coached youth soccer on Saturday mornings, the U10 girls team. And he had genuine uncomplicated joy on that field, something about the sheer chaotic energy of 10 small people chasing a ball that made him feel lighter than he felt anywhere else. He brought coffee to every member of his operations team on the first Monday of each month without fail, and he remembered how they each took it. He was not a cartoon, he was not a monster. He was a man who had built a life on a set of assumptions that had never been named because they had never needed to be named, because nothing in the lobbies and the briefings and the VIP arrivals of 22 years had ever pushed back hard enough to name them. He looked at a tall black man with a garment bag near the service corridor, and he knew, without a thought, without a pause, what that man was. He had a senator arriving in an hour. He had security protocols and a venue reputation and a timeline. He was, in the technical sense, doing his job. But the job had an assumption built into its foundation that had been running so long it had become infrastructure. And infrastructure doesn't get examined. Infrastructure just runs. He didn't know Claire Hartwell was on the building's ownership board. He hadn't checked, because why would he? He knew this building. He didn't know the Foundation's briefing document was in the operations folder on the shared server because his coordinator hadn't surfaced it to him, which wasn't an excuse, just the operational chain failing in the way operational chains fail when no one is checking carefully enough from the top. He walked toward Marcus with the certainty of a man who had been right for 22 years, which is a very specific kind of certainty. The kind that doesn't feel like certainty anymore. That just feels like the world. He put his hand on Marcus's arm, and the arm was completely still, and something about that stillness gave him the briefest pause, a half-second of registered wrongness that he didn't have enough space to interpret before the voice came from the registration table. "Excuse me." Claire covered the 30 feet in the unhurried stride of someone who has decided what's going to happen and simply needs to arrive. She was aware of the lobby around her, the guests at the margins, the catering staff moving toward the ballroom, the two coordinators at the registration table who had stopped talking when she stood up, the soft adjustment and ambient attention that accompanies any disruption in a well-managed event space. She noted all of it and did not perform for any of it. She stopped in front of Preston. She was 1.5 feet shorter than him and almost 2 feet shorter than Marcus, and she stood between them in the marble lobby with the binder under her arm and the portfolio in her hand, and she looked at Preston with the focused attention of someone who has identified a problem and is in the process of solving it. "What's the basis for this?" she said. Preston blinked. "I beg your pardon." "What is the basis?" she said again, precisely, without agitation, the way she had repeated questions in depositions for 7 years before she left law to run the Foundation, for removing this guest from the building. "This gentleman isn't on our— Have you checked the guest list?" Preston's hand was still on Marcus's arm. He released it. She watched the decision happen, the calculation, the half-second of recalibration, and when he released it she did not mark it or acknowledge it. She was already moving to the next part. "The guest list is managed by the Foundation's coordination team." "Yes." Claire opened the binder to page 4. She held it up. She was not aggressive with it. She was presenting information, the way she'd always presented information, clearly, without theater. "Marcus Webb, Table of Honor, keynote speaker. He's been on this list since February." The lobby had developed a particular texture around them. The ambient sound unchanged, the string quartet still warming up beyond the ballroom doors, but the attention shifted. The way a room shifts when something real surfaces through the social layer. 2 guests with champagne glasses had not moved in 30 seconds. One of the catering staff had slowed near the service door. Near the elevator bank, 2 of the Foundation's board members had stopped their conversation. Preston looked at the binder. "I wasn't informed of— The operations briefing went to your team on the 14th, Claire said. She said this evenly. It included the full guest list, arrival protocols, and hospitality suite assignments. Mr. Webb's entry was on page 4. I didn't receive— Would it help to pull it up now?" She was already reaching into the portfolio. Not with urgency, with the practical economy of a person closing a gap. She had the Foundation's shared drive open on her phone and was 4 taps from the document. Marcus spoke then, for the first time since the confrontation had started. "It's fine," he said. His voice was quiet. It did not invite argument. The 2 words were not resignation, they were its opposite, a controlled closing, the way someone closes a door gently when they could close it hard and have decided not to. "It isn't fine," Claire said. She said it without looking at him. She was still looking at Preston. Not with anger, not with righteousness, not performing anything for the witnesses around her. She was a person who had seen something happen and had identified it precisely, the way she'd been trained to identify things, and she was not in the habit of leaving identified problems unaddressed. Preston's expression was running two calculations simultaneously. One operational, how do I recover the professional surface of this situation? One slower and harder, the kind that requires something close to honesty, the kind of calculation most people avoid because it requires admitting the existence of a room they've never entered. Mr. Vance. This was a new voice. Dina Park had been managing the senator's security detail on the far side of the lobby. She had seen the situation from 40 feet away and processed it the way a veteran event coordinator processes a lobby. Her entire field of attention rearranging around what her body had already classified as a crisis before her mind had fully named it. She was moving quickly now, her heels audible on the marble, slightly breathless in a way that was unusual for Dina, who was known across the Foundation's staff as constitutionally unruffled. Mr. Webb. She arrived and addressed him directly, which was the right move, and she made it without hesitation. I am so sorry, we expected you through the main entrance. Your hospitality suite coordinator was supposed to be waiting. I know the building, Marcus said. He said it simply, not to wound Preston, just as a fact. Dina looked at Preston. Her expression was professional. Her eyes contained something else entirely. Mr. Webb is our keynote speaker this evening, she said. He's a Medal of Honor recipient. Both are in the briefing document sent to venue operations on the 14th. Page 2 and page 4, Claire said. Dina glanced at her. Something passed between them. Something efficient and complete, the kind of exchange that people who have been running operations together for a long time can fit into a look. Preston said nothing. He was looking at Marcus, and what was crossing his face was not immediately nameable. It was something in the vicinity of understanding arriving the way a heavy thing arrives when dropped, not with speed but with complete and irreversible weight. A couple who had been signing in at the center of the registration table had stopped signing in. The two board members near the elevator bank had not resumed their conversation. Near the ballroom entrance, a woman who was the Foundation's largest individual donor, a woman who had written a check for $400,000 the prior spring and who knew Marcus Webb personally from the program's advisory committee, had stopped walking and was watching. The lobby knew something was happening. Lobbies always do. Marcus hadn't moved. Still the garment bag over his left shoulder. Still the right hand at his side. The scar on his left thumb caught the chandelier light briefly. That small white line, the only visible mark of the thing he carried and never mentioned. Mr. Webb, Preston said finally. He stopped. He was choosing something. She could see him choosing it. I owe you an apology. The words landed in the lobby the way certain words land, not loudly, but completely. It's handled, Marcus said. The same two words. The same closed door. Preston nodded once, with the stiffness of a man processing something that will take more time than he has right now. He turned toward his event coordinator, said something quiet, and walked toward the service corridor. He did not look back. Dina stood for a moment with her clipboard at her side, watching him go. Then she turned to Marcus with the expression of someone who has a great deal to say and is choosing none of it. The suite is ready whenever you are, she said. East corridor, second right. Marcus looked at Claire. Claire was looking at the binder in her hands. Then she looked up. Their eyes held for a moment. Not long. Long enough. She nodded once. He nodded once. He walked toward the corridor, the garment bag over his shoulder, his hands at his sides, completely still. The gala opened at 7:30. Graham, the program director, introduced the Foundation's work in 3 minutes of clear and unornamented language. He talked about the housing program and the employment pipeline and the 47 people who had used the Foundation's services to reconstruct something that resembled a life. There was a video. 8 minutes, very quiet, several people in it describing in their own words what it was like to come home from a war and find that home meant nothing. Several people in the ballroom looked at their champagne glasses during parts of the video which was about shame. Shame is useful when it finds the right audience. Then Graham said, I'd like to introduce the woman who made this organization possible, who wrote the first check when there was no check to be written, who sat in an empty office in January of 2015 with a legal pad and a phone and started calling veterans she had never met. The founder and executive director of the Veterans Legacy Foundation, Dr. Claire Hartwell. The room applauded immediately and at full volume. This was not how rooms typically respond to introductions at galas, where applause usually arrives gradually and with social calibration, each person waiting to see how much the person beside them is clapping before committing. This was immediate. This was a room that knew what it was applauding. Claire walked to the podium. She was still wearing the ivory blouse and dark slacks from the registration table. She had not changed. She had not put on heels. She set the leather portfolio on the podium's edge and looked at the room and waited one full beat before she spoke, which she always did, because that beat, that 1 second of held silence, was the thing that told a room it was about to hear something worth hearing. She spoke for 4 minutes and 30 seconds. She did not use notes. At one point she said, "I started this foundation because I kept meeting people who had given the most the country could ask of anyone and had come home to nothing. And I kept thinking that someone should do something about that. And then I realized I'd been thinking that my entire life about a great many things. And I decided to stop waiting for the someone." The room was very quiet. In the East Wing corridor, through the glass partition separating the operations area from the ballroom, Preston Vance's senior coordinator had located the briefing document on her tablet and was scrolling through it slowly, holding the screen so he could see. On page 2 was the program overview. On page 3 was the guest list. On page 4 were the biographies. Dr. Claire Hartwell, founder and executive director, J.D., Georgetown Law, M.A., Columbia University. Member, Meridian Capital Board of Directors, 2018 to present. There was a photograph, the same ivory blouse, the same leather portfolio on the table beside her. The coordinator scrolled to the keynote section. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, U.S. Army, retired. 22 years of service. 3 combat deployments. Medal of Honor 2009 for actions under fire in Kunar Province, Afghanistan. Veterans Legacy Foundation board member. Keynote speaker. Preston read it the way people read things they should have read 2 hours ago. He looked through the glass partition at the ballroom. The senator at the reserved table, the board members, the staff, the 200 people who had written checks for this cause and who were now listening to a woman 4 feet 11 inches tall at a podium tell them what the cause looked like in practice, in winter, in a man finding a shelf to put up in his daughter's room. He stood in the operations corridor for a long time without moving. Marcus spoke at 8:45. He came to the podium in his dress uniform, and the room absorbed it the way rooms absorb things that are larger than what they're holding. In a single collected breath, a full stop. The uniform was immaculate. The Medal of Honor was at his throat. He stood at the podium for a moment before speaking, and the room had the quality of something gathered, something leaning forward. 200 people suddenly understanding that the next several minutes were going to be different from the rest of the evening. He spoke for 12 minutes. He did not use notes. He talked about Garrett, the shelf, the daughter, the alternate weekends. He talked about what the foundation's housing program had actually cost to build and what it had actually returned, in dollars and in things that don't convert to dollars. He talked about the difference between charity and accountability, and at one point he said something that nobody in the room wrote down but that several people would find themselves repeating in the weeks that followed, in different settings to different people, with the particular precision of someone quoting something they have not forgotten. He said, "The bravest thing is almost always the quiet thing. The thing that doesn't look like bravery from the outside." Most of you will never know the name of the coordinator who found my friend Garrett sleeping under a bridge in November, and that coordinator will never care that you don't know her name. That's what service actually looks like. That's what we're trying to build. He stepped back from the podium. The applause lasted long enough to be uncomfortable in the way that real applause sometimes is. The kind that asks you to sit with something rather than simply acknowledge it. Claire was at a table against the far wall, to the left of the stage. When Marcus passed her table on his way back from the podium, she was writing in the leather portfolio. Not a line this time, but words, in the small neat script she used for things she wanted to keep. He couldn't see what she'd written. She looked up. He slowed for half a step. Then he kept walking. The evening thinned slowly, the way formal evenings always do, in groups and gradients, people finding each other at the margins. Coats retrieved, cars called, the social mathematics of a room trying to empty itself gracefully. By 10:40 the ballroom was half full. By 11 it was a third. Marcus had said his last thank you by 11:15. He'd removed the dress uniform jacket and draped it over the garment bag. He was standing near the main lobby exit, in the particular stillness of a man who has done the thing he came to do and is waiting for his body to remember what it does next, when Claire came through from the side corridor with her binder under her arm and the portfolio in her hand, doing the mental accounting of a person reviewing a completed evening. She slowed when she reached him. She stopped. They stood in the lobby of Meridian Tower, the chandeliers still bright, the marble floor bare now, the cleaning crew beginning at the far end near the ballroom entrance, and neither of them said anything for a moment that lasted longer than moments usually last. Then Marcus said, "You moved the table." Claire looked at him. That pause, the one held breath, released. 4 feet, she said, the light. He nodded slowly. He'd noticed it when he'd finally come through the lobby after changing. The way the table sat clear of the late evening glare from the west-facing panels. Someone had thought about the light. He turned the old military watch on his wrist. She'd been watching for an involuntary gesture all evening, and this was the only one she'd seen. That small rotation, almost unconscious, the single thing in him that moved when it didn't intend to. "You do that for every event?" he said. "Only the ones I care about." He was quiet for a moment. The lobby was very still around them. "He'll think about tonight," Marcus said. "He'll think about the liability," Claire said. "A beat." "That counts," Marcus said. She considered it. "It's a start," she said. "It's not the same as it actually counting." He looked at her. He seemed to be deciding whether to say something else. Then he decided not to, which she respected. She opened the leather portfolio. Not to write, just the habit of it, the reaching for the familiar thing. The line was still there on the page, the one she'd drawn at 3:35 in the afternoon, a single thin blue line on an otherwise blank page. She looked at it for a moment. "You didn't need me," she said. "No," Marcus said. He let the word settle. Then, "But that's not really the point, is it?" It wasn't a question. She looked up at him. "No," she said, "it isn't." The lobby was almost silent. Somewhere near the ballroom entrance, a cleaning cart moved slowly across the marble, the sound of it low and rhythmic. The chandeliers were beginning to dim by degrees. She closed the portfolio and adjusted the binder under her arm and walked toward the glass doors. He pulled on the uniform jacket and turned toward the elevator bank that would take him to the metro level. They did not look back at each other. They didn't need to. The evening had already said what needed saying, and neither of them were people who repeated themselves. Preston Vance drove home that night in a car that felt different than it had in the morning. Not in any mechanical sense, but in the sense that something had shifted in the person operating it. His wife was still awake when he came in. She looked at him the way she sometimes looked at him when she already knew something had happened and was waiting to see if he'd bring it. He said, "Fine." Then he said, "There was a situation." Then he went to his home office and sat for a long time with the briefing document printed on paper in front of him, reading it once and then again, and then once more after that. Whether that becomes anything, whether it lodged somewhere it could grow, whether it produced any real change in the 22-year architecture of his instincts, nobody standing in that lobby that night could say. These things are private and slow and mostly invisible, and the people who cause them rarely get to know the outcome. What can be said is simpler than that. 2 people left Meridian Tower that evening who had been fully seen by each other, possibly for the first time in a long time, in a room that had spent the whole night trying to make them smaller. They had walked into that room exactly as they were. They walked out exactly as they were. That was the whole victory and the whole point. Marcus Webb had stood near a service elevator with a Medal of Honor in his pocket and 200 guests arriving around him, and he had been still. Not because stillness was weakness. Because stillness was the hardest discipline, the choice to remain precisely who you are when the room is asking you to be something diminished. 22 years of service had not taught him that. Life had. The Army had only confirmed it. And Claire Hartwell had drawn a single line on a blank page in a leather portfolio at 3:35 in the afternoon in an empty lobby. And the line meant, I know where I stand. She had always known where she stood. The room just needed to catch up. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs it. And subscribe. There are more stories like this one waiting.